In the 1960s, Africa was ravaged by war. Sponsored by Cold War superpowers and withdrawing colonial nations, proxy armies launched brutal campaigns that would last for decades. As these conflicts spread, South Africa found itself increasingly surrounded by pro-communist forces. Internationally isolated and subject to an arms embargo for its policy of apartheid, South Africa became increasingly reliant on mercenaries. These mercenaries would later be sent abroad, where they would end up embroiled in madcap schemes to overthrow unsympathetic governments or topple dictators.
A guy came running out of one of the offices with an AK-47, with PLO painted on the wooden butt, and all hell was let loose.
Hardened by such endless violence, others emerged to form one of the most feared mercenary forces ever seen, the 3-2 Battalion.
The history of private military companies in South Africa stems from the war in Angola. That left well-trained, well-motivated and capable men out of work, looking for something to do.
When we're talking about the 3-2 Battalion, it's the Angolan born. And the Angolians, they were born to fight.
And some, guided by an ex-Etonian SAS officer, attempted an audacious military coup.
There you've got a tyranny, which is a dreadful thing. You've got a great adventure and the possibility of making a lot of money all together. Who would say no?
This is the story of how dogs of war shaped post-colonial Africa and how one unit in particular became infamous for mercenary actions right up until the present day. The 3-2 Battalion. In 2004, ex-3-2 Battalion members attempted to topple the government of President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo of Equatorial Guinea.
The Wanga coup, as it became known, the attempt to depose President Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, was to put in someone who was acceptable not just to some Western states, but also would have been very useful for the PMCs who were trying to carry out the coup there.
The coup was backed by a number of high-profile Western businessmen who planned to replace Obiang with Severo Moto, an opposition leader living in exile in Spain, who would award them lucrative oil deals.
When I was asked to do the coup, I sent my own people onto the ground very quickly, because as far as I was concerned, it was critical that the regime should be bloody awful. And the more awful, the better, from my point of view, because I wanted as much justification in the moral sense, but also I wanted it from the practical sense that we had to sell what we were going to do to the international community. If you live under tyranny, it's very hard to escape unless somebody helps you from outside, and really, really awful to live under it.
Several security services around the world were aware of the plan. The British intelligence service received a full outline of the coup months before it was launched. The orchestrator, former SAS officer Simon Mann, was certain he was acting with the backing of several foreign governments.
I was 100% certain that the Spanish and the South African governments were fully aware of what we were doing. I also believed that the American government might dimly be in the background of what was happening. If you are invited to do a coup d'etat, then the probability is that there will be all sorts of people and interests behind that invitation, behind the people backing, that you will never ever know. And of course, if things go well, people will appear for their payday. If things go badly, there is nobody going to be there with you. You're on your own then. You know, you have overt operations, you have covert operations, and you have clandestine operations. What's the difference between covert and clandestine? Clandestine is deniable and will always be denied.
Well, you know, I was not told that we're going to go there. They said we're going to be the security forces for the mine. And then we got in a plane, we were issued blue uniform, and so there was spared and everything. I believe they're going to be in the mine.
Nick du Toit, a former officer from 3-2 Battalion, headed to Equatorial Guinea with an advance party of 14 mercenaries. They would be joined a few weeks later by a further 67 mercenaries, including Simon Mann.
Nick was the 3-2 Battalion officer. Then he was a executive outcomes officer, definitely a good one. And then he became my 2IC for the attempted coup against Equatorial Guinea. He actually had to organise the men and the kit. The guys who are doing the operation have to own the operation. It's no good you kind of laying the law down and saying you've got to do it this way or that way. They've got to own what they're going to do. And so basically the kind of arrangement between us was it can be his plan, but I have to okay it.
The coup unravelled when the Boeing 727 carrying the mercenaries stopped over at Zimbabwe's Harare City airport to pick up a shipment of weaponry. Mann had ordered the weapons, 20 machine guns, 61 AK-47 assault rifles, 150 hand grenades, 10 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, 100 RPG shells, and 75,000 rounds of ammunition from Zimbabwe Defence Industries, the government's own arms manufacturer. So he assumed he had their approval. But something had gone wrong. Mann and the other mercenaries were arrested. 2 days later, du Toit and the advance party were arrested in Equatorial Guinea.
We had been invited to go and check the weapons and the ammunition that we'd bought was indeed there and present and correct. And we very quickly realised it was not. I remember looking up at one of the other guys, and he looked at me, and at that moment, get down off the truck. And I look to see who's asking that, and as I look, I see all around the truck a well-armed team. And we're nicked. But I also thought that there might be a misunderstanding that we were going to be able to resolve. I think it was the first 7 days or something. I was in police holding tanks, you know, police holding cells, because they didn't want to admit that they'd got me, because I think they were trying to work out what to do with me to begin with, and that they didn't want me to be officially a prisoner. And then I think they also thought that they might be able to whisk me out of the country to Equatorial Guinea, where I could be shot there, because they were the target country. So I was moving through these police holding cells, and they were really bad. I mean, you know, like 40 people in a room. You couldn't lie down, no lights, shit all over the place, blood all over the place. I thought, well, you know, they might shoot me, they're probably going to torture me, they might hang me. And I immediately, of course, thought about, you know, Amanda and the children and all that sort of stuff.
You know, sometimes when I think about it, it's really very painful. The situation to feel being arrested, they mistreat us. You know, Zimbabwe, there's no law there in Zimbabwe. They will do anything. We lost our friends, they got sick in prison. We arrested like, I mean, you have nothing to say. Receive you from the airplane, downstairs, kick you and boots on your head, waiting for someone to come and handcuff you, put you in the truck to get prison. I mean, we just started knowing more when we were in prison. Then they started talking, the missions of the mine, it was gonna be the coup. If they could tell us from the beginning, nobody was gonna participate in that.
Initially, Mann and the other mercenaries were jailed in Zimbabwe, but later extradited to Equatorial Guinea, where they were tried for conspiring to oust the president. Simon Mann and Nick du Toit both received 34-year sentences. Footage of former 3-2 Battalion in chains was broadcast around the world, greatly embarrassing the South African government. And there was embarrassment in London too, as the coup was linked to several high-profile British businessmen. Many of the mercenaries, including Mann and du Toit, were pardoned after serving only a fraction of their sentences.
When I was asked to do Equatorial Guinea, I'd made a lot of money already. I didn't need to do it. But here was an opportunity to do something absolutely cold. I don't have to do it. I'm not being forced into it. But it is the right thing to do. Then, you know, if you like, my whole life then will become an achievement that I could be really proud of. Didn't work out. But, you know, there you've got a tyranny, which is a dreadful thing. You've got a great adventure and the possibility of making a lot of money all together. Who would say no? It's not easy. It's fantastic jeopardy. And I think if you do something like that only for money and you end up dead, you can't spend the money. It just doesn't make any sense.
The roots of the 3-2 Battalion are entwined with the 23-year-long border war that raged across southwest Africa and the Angolan War of Independence, which was particularly long-lasting and brutal.
The roots of the war go back into a freedom struggle. There were several different guerrilla outfits who were all fighting against the Portuguese occupation. And that then morphed into this proxy war, whereby those same guerrilla units were now being backed by South Africa, in the case of the Western backed, or by the Cubans, in the case of the Eastern Soviet bloc. They were fighting that war from about 1965 onwards, you know, unbelievable and huge suffering.
During the War of Independence, 3 groups of rebels fought to overthrow the Portuguese colonial power.
The 3 big wars in Angola, Mozambique and Portuguese Guinea, which very few people know about. But in fact, Lisbon fought a succession of guerrilla wars for more than a dozen years, and that is twice as long as the Americans were in Vietnam. And proportionate to their population, they lost more casualties in their African wars than the Americans did in Vietnam.
Angola Civil War, was a big one. I was freedom fight. I started 1965, fighting against the Portuguese because was taking our country.
There was the National Front of Angola, the FNLA, led by Holden Roberto. The National Union for Angolan Independence, UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, and the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, led by Augustinho Neto and Lucia Lara.
Nós começamos com a FNLA e nosso presidente foi o Holden Roberto. E nós, quando começamos, ele disse que não queríamos comunismo. E então nós ali seguramos arma para combater contra o comunismo. Nos treinos, fizemos no Quincuso, e depois dos treinos, viemos em Angola.
The FNLA would eventually become the legendary mercenary unit, the 3-2 Battalion.
3-2 Battalion started in Angola as freedom fighters, comrades, focused to fight against the liberation of Angola.
Before expelling the Portuguese, a bloody civil war erupted among the 3 parties. Soon, foreign nations backed the rebel group most likely to be sympathetic to their interests.
The Cubans, they linked together with Russians because the Cubans wanted to influence Angola to become a communist country like Cuba.
With Soviet and Cuban support, the MPLA president was able to consolidate his power.
Mr. President Dr. Augustinho Neto was sending us young people to Moscow to training. I training about 1 year, learn guerrilla war, you know, to make it, to stay in the bush, how to fight the enemy.
With constant small-scale battles erupting in the bush, the FNLA and UNITA found themselves thrust into an uneasy alliance against the MPLA, whose communist support had made them the dominant power.
The president, he said, you must fight against UNITA. You fight against the FNLA.
As the civil war intensified, all 3 sides would come to rely on mercenaries. First to make overtures, was the FNLA.
Basically, the FNLA were advertising for soldiers to come and fight for them, and they were offering money.
One man who took the offer was a disgraced British paratrooper, the notorious Colonel Callan, aka Costas Georgiou. Callan was soon commanding a group of Portuguese and Cypriot mercenaries for the FNLA.
Callan was probably the worst type of mercenary, i.e. he was very good at killing people, but no real skills in terms of man management or training beyond what he had naturally had. He was, I think, quite a brutal man, and certainly his brutality became very obvious in Angola when he was prepared to do anything to his men.
Initially, Callan led his group to great success. In one battle, a squad-sized unit of his mercenaries attacked a column of 600 MPLA and Cuban soldiers, killing 60 of them, destroying 4 tanks and 4 rocket platforms. Callan lost just 4 men. Despite this success, the unit was too small to influence the conflict significantly. But they had impressed Holden Roberto, who sent an envoy to Britain to hire an entire battalion. Great pay and a chance to see the world attracted large numbers of civilians with little or no military experience. Callan still managed to lead them on several successful missions, but it couldn't last. Under-equipped and facing combined MPLA and Cuban tanks and crack troops, the mercenary force soon fell apart. What happened next shocked everyone. Some of Callan's mercenaries had deserted after shooting some of their own men by mistake. They were captured and delivered to Callan.
Colonel Callan, who's a lunatic, shot 14 of his own men, British guys, young fellows that were hired in England to fight for him. The entire unit was eventually almost wiped out by the Angolans, headed by the Cubans.
In 1976, Callan was put on trial by the MPLA. He and 3 of his men were sentenced to death. Callan was executed by firing squad. The power struggle continued to tear Angola apart, with the MPLA becoming the dominant force, seizing control over 11 of Angola's 15 regions.
Então, dali, nós tivemos que combater com o MPLA e o MPLA foi buscar os cubanos.
We heard the rumors. There are Cubans at the other side, and there's other forces other side.
News of the MPLA's new allies quickly spread through the ranks of the FNLA.
Depois do MPLA, o Agostinho veio buscar os comandos, o Mr. Chipenda vem buscar sul africanos para nos ajudar.
South Africa responded by sending nearly 2,000 troops across the border to support the ideologically sympathetic UNITA and FNLA. The combined South African, FNLA and UNITA forces quickly captured 5 MPLA provinces. South Africa's intervention set in motion a series of military exchanges and conflicts which would plague the region for the next 15 years. The MPLA fought back with the help of 18,000 Cuban troops. These forces would meet on the 10th of November 1975 in what became known as the Battle for Quifangondo. Holden Roberto, the head of the FNLA, ignored his advisors and attempted to recapture the Angolan capital, Luanda. Roberto ordered a full frontal assault on the city, with 2,000 FNLA troops, 1,500 Zairean troops, and 52 South Africans, with their artillery and air force. Although they outnumbered the 1,000 MPLA, they came up against a dug-in and determined force, with advanced Soviet weaponry and 188 Cuban advisors. The assault became a slaughter. The battle became known as the Nshila Walufu, the Road of Death, and effectively destroyed the FNLA.
E depois, o mais velho, o nosso presidente disse que não, vocês têm que recuar porque estão matando muito povo. Como que vocês estão matando muito povo e eu, quando vou ser presidente, vou mandar a quem? Para nós sairmos de lá daquela batalha, então mandaram-nos para nós recuar.
What was left of the FNLA fled to neighbouring Zaire and the country now known as Namibia. But these FNLA soldiers were not finished. They soon regrouped, rearmed, and would become known and feared as 3-2 Battalion. It's 1975, and one of the rebel armies in Angola's long-running civil war has fled to southwest Africa, battered and bruised. But this was not their end. They were met by the South African Defence Force and hired to act as a buffer in southern Angola. Colonel Jan Breitenbach was tasked with transforming the surviving troops into a counter-insurgency force known as 3-2 Battalion.
3-2 Battalion were a bunch of Angolan guys recruited by the South African Defence Force as a kind of local force during the Angolan War. So they were Angolans recruited and paid to fight Angolans. They certainly have a hell of a reputation. They were very ruthless, very effective.
Now armed and disciplined, they were once again ready to return to Angola and to battle.
A nossa força é de ir mais combater contra os cubanos com muita força.
Tunakalwazita verdade niku luani comunismo na África. Ni futi ya hazi inakanika ngo 32 angolano kana luila contra comunismo ana luila democracia.
The battalion's motto became Proelio Procusi, or forged in battle, reflecting their military past. The battalion consisted of 600 riflemen, split into 6 companies, a recce wing and a support company. Each company was led by South African officers and by non-commissioned officers from Rhodesia, Portugal, Australia and the United States. Deployed in small groups, 3-2 Battalion would operate for weeks on end to disrupt and clear enemy activity. The existence of the battalion was kept secret even within the South African Defence Force for many years. The troops would go into Angola with unmarked equipment, giving the South African government plausible deniability should any member of the force be captured.
Without 3-2 Battalion before, the South African Defence Force was so weak. Then after, when they decided to put the Angolians in their military, they had good training from before in Angola, then South Africans Defence Force training that make them special.
On the 25th of November 1981, South Africa allegedly backed one of the most daring coups of the entire Cold War with the support of the US. They enlisted 51 mercenaries to topple Seychelles President Frans Albert Rene, who was suspected of having Soviet sympathies, and restore his deposed predecessor, James Mancham. The unit was under the command of Mad Mike Hoare, the legendary Irish mercenary who had carved out a formidable reputation fighting in the Congo.
I was approached by Mike Hoare and saying he had a little operation on the go, was available. Well, the whole thing was that we were actually going to work with the Seychelles, who wanted Rene out. They never voted him in. He'd seized power using 200 troops from Tanzania, who were still on the island, and in fact they were garrisoning the whole place. They had a barracks at the end of the runway. We were flying in as a charity group, once we were familiar with the whole island, then meeting up with the Seychelles, and we would seize the armory. That was the whole idea, to get extra weapons. And the Seychelles movement would be on standby, and they would move in, and they would do it, and we would assist them. And we had wristbands to identify ourselves and firefight, know who's who. And it was obviously intended to be a bloodless coup.
The plan was simple, but there was trouble as soon as they landed.
When we were going through customs, then the guy searched the guy's handbag, one of our guys, and discovered that the mercenary had a AK in the false bottom of his luggage. I went out to warn the guys. A Seychelles guy came running out of one of the offices with an AK-47, and then all hell was let loose. We had the airport within a few minutes. There was a group sent to the barracks at the end of the runway to overrun the barracks, and we got there, and that was defended. So it was a bit of a firefight there.
Although Mike Hoare and his men had taken the airport, they weren't able to stop aircraft trying to land.
It was not part of our plan at all, but civilian aircraft en route to Bombay to refuel The pilot knew there was something up. There was not proper comms with the control tower. And what happened was he was in a holding pattern for 50 minutes, flying around, trying to figure out what was happening ground to get permission to land. And we stood there watching this plane. And Mike Orr said, I hope this plane's not going to land. Anyway, eventually he ran out of fuel.
The Tanzanian troops believed the plane carried further mercenary reinforcements.
The garrison has assumed that this probably was reinforcements for the group already on the ground. And to give them their due, they fired red flares at the plane to turn it around. They ignored the red flares and they came in. Then they opened up with the 12.7. You could see the tracer rounds going at the aircraft. What we didn't know was that Tanzanians had driven down the runway and parked a truck to stop the plane landing. When the pilot came in, he was running out of runway and he clipped the one truck and knocked the flap off the plane. And we knew nothing about this. We couldn't see it because it's 1,000 meters long, whatever. Eventually, taxis around, they came in.
The pilot eventually agreed to fly the mercenaries wherever they wanted to go, so long as they got the plane and passengers out of Equatorial Guinea alive. But before they could take off, they needed to refuel.
I personally went down with 2 Szechuan to refuel the aircraft. And he asked me to sign a receipt for the fuel, which I did. I put Lieutenant General Mickey Mouse, give it to Rene in the morning. Anyway, prior to taking off, we said we'd try and negotiate a ceasefire with Rene. We managed to get through to him on the phone, and we said permission for this aircraft to take off with these passengers, and he would agree to the ceasefire.
45 of Hoare's mercenaries escaped aboard an Air India jet that was flown to Durban. 1 mercenary had died, and 6 were left behind. 4 of the 6 were sentenced to death. 1 was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, and the other 10. But after negotiations, all were eventually returned to South Africa in mid-1983. The failure of the coup would tarnish the reputations of both the US and South Africa. Back along the Angolan border, 3-2 Battalion continued to perform successfully. In 1986, the MPLA attempted to totally destroy the UNITA forces once and for all. A 10,000-strong MPLA force led by Soviet officers and supported by 15,000 Cubans launched Operation Greeting October and began pushing into UNITA-held territory. Initially, they succeeded in forcing UNITA into a retreat, but when they got to the River Lomba, UNITA decided to make a stand, and alongside them was the South African military and 3-2 Battalion.
If you see the MPLA, they used to send them to Cuba, receive the training. Some send them to Soviet, Russia. But when they came back, remember that Africa is Africa. Only African can conquer another African. That's the trick that you remember. The MPLA was good, but not good to the standard that we were training hard, and we knew. And the reason why we used to beat him, because it's our homeboys and our home families. We know each other, speak the same language.
O culto carnaval é nós mesmo como somos strong. Ok, exemplo lhe fala assim, né? Tenho abrigos assim. Tá vendo? Esta aqui é inimigo, hein? Aqui temos que fazer tiros para entrar nesse buraco. Nós temos que entrar ali. You must be power to go in until to take all these people out, and then you must win in the place.
I mean, you had the South African army on the ground. I mean, there was a tank battle, which you can see today. I mean, the tanks are still there, of a Second World War scale, with hundreds of tanks, heavy artillery, massed air attacks, etc., etc. This is it was a full-on war.
Vencemos porque nós também temos os tanques, eles também têm os tanques, mas nós temos mais tática do que os gajos, é por isso que nós vencemos. A nossa tática que foi assim, eles estão a vir assim, e nós manda grupo aqui atrás, tá vendo, né? Como vocês querem vencer, eles estão a vir assim, eles só dão por conta que ali. Agora, aqui também tem outros, como dizia que, já que eles são, como dizemos, que é o REC, como esse jeito.
Fierce fighting ensued, and the MPLA was soon taking heavy losses. Their Soviet advisors then withdrew, leaving the MPLA without leadership. The South African Defence Forces and UNITA launched a counter-offensive called Operation Hooper.
Esse que está aqui é que tem que dar o ângulo, você que está ali para mandar, para vocês vencerem essa pessoa, porque tem que ver lá uma pessoa, como Reg, é Reg o nome dele, daquele grupo. Ele tem que observar isso, ele dá o ângulo, para vocês meterem bem as bombas ali, para vocês poderem vencer.
On the 3rd of October 1986, the South African Defence Force annihilated a battalion of MPLA troops and forced the rest to retreat back to the town of Cuito-Cuanavale. The town was besieged under heavy artillery fire. Without their own functioning artillery or armour, the MPLA faced being wiped out and requested immediate assistance from Cuba. Fidel Castro believed that if Cuito-Cuanavale fell, it would be the end for his allies in Angola. He responded by sending a further 15,000 elite Cuban soldiers. This became the largest battle in Africa since the Second World War. But neither side was able to secure a decisive victory. The arms embargo placed on South Africa in 1977 had taken effect. Its aging air force was unable to compete with the Cuban state-of-the-art MiG-23s and air defences. This forced the South African Defence Force to withdraw the majority of their forces, leaving behind small units to disrupt any enemy advance and continue the artillery barrage on Cuito-Cuanavale. The Cuban and Angolan forces surrounded their positions and took the initiative for the first time, but the bloody stalemate continued. South Africa's brutal border wars dragged on into the late 1980s despite massive political and financial fatigue. A rift grew between Cuba and the Soviet Union on how to deal with the continued problem presented by UNITA, led by the charismatic Western-backed Jonas Savimbi and their 3-2 battalion allies. The Soviets once again took the lead and deployed over 1,000 advisors in an attempt to capture the town of Mavinga on the way to Jamba, the UNITA stronghold.
Savimbi was once a leader who's a fearless man. Whenever there is a big target, the first attack, he want to be there present himself, to go with him in front. You never think about going to attack Jamba, because in Jamba was everything is there, where Savimbi was. There was Air Force, trained him, his own people. There was artilleries, well set up. There was military police. There was people guarding that whole town all over, exit and entrance, everything. So for you to think about to go and attack Jamba, you will think twice, Chief, because 5 or 10 kilometers before you reach the target that you want, you will get into the walls.
At Mavinga, they would face a dug-in UNITA and South African Defence Force.
If I look back, if I think back, I mean, I wouldn't be surviving up to now because, you know, 24 hours, MiGs on top, throwing bombs, infantry advancing, you know, push to push. We push them, they push us, they push them, we push us, we push them, push us, tactic to tactics. Then we became a joint venture with UNITAs to fight the MPLA.
UNITA and South Africa used the greater mobility of their armoured vehicles to outmaneuver the MPLA's slower tanks. South Africa's state-of-the-art G5 long-range artillery bombarded the Soviet-led forces.
Luckily, because when we become stronger forces, it took us some time. And thank God that our guys, just few got hurt, but in UNITA were a lot of casualty, but the enemy was small because we managed to push, even though it took us time, to push in to the area where we wanted to overcome the war, even though they were mixed with the Cubans and some of the Russian soldiers there. If you are currently in that situation, you know, it become like you are dreaming or half dead or what, because everything you do, it's between you and death. So the time for you to think how it's gonna be is less. So all you think is just to focus. Now, either the enemy kill me or I kill the enemy. Just to stand your ground. That's all mentality that you have in that war.
The assault on Mavinga resulted in 4,000 Soviet and MPLA casualties and exposed flaws in the Soviet military doctrine, embarrassing them internationally. By 1988, there had been so much bloodshed that all sides were exhausted, and looking for a way to end the violence.
At the end, like all wars, the negotiating table beckoned. And that was as a result of American, Portuguese, Russian involvement.
A peace accord was signed in 1988. South Africa agreed to withdraw from Angola by the 1st of September and granted Southwest Africa independence. In return, the Cuban forces would withdraw. After 23 years, the conflict ended, with both sides claiming victory. With the Cold War itself drawing to a close, South Africa no longer had to tackle communist sympathizers along its borders. 3-2 Battalion's actions during the second half of the war earned them the title O Terrível, the Terrible Ones. With more enemy kills than anyone else, these Angolan soldiers became one of the most highly decorated units in the South African Defence Force and were awarded with 13 honorary crew medals for bravery.
The medal is being given individual by those who were bravest. You understand? And when you are bravest, let me say for instance, you and I, we go in the battle and you get shot and I make sure that I don't leave you behind. I carry you and I fought from the enemy until I'll bring you back and you survive. That's when we got those medals.
The border wars were over, but because 3-2 Battalion had fought against the side now in power, they could not return home. The apartheid regime withdrew them to the town of Pomfrey.
First of all, we told, you guys all gonna move to South Africa, you're gonna have a good life. And then the time came, we jumped in the buses, then we drove all the way to Pomfrey. Pomfrey used to be asbestos mine. That's why some of our kids got infected eye problem and heart problem because of that. They tell you, okay, you and so your number is this. Then you go straight to the house that they gave you.
They would serve a new role in South Africa. They were sent to put down revolts in the townships and were soon using the same tactics they had learnt during years at war. The fact that predominantly black soldiers fought against anti-apartheid protesters left them hated among the majority black population.
Quando aqui nós ouve tiro, só ir lá tirar as armas daquela pessoa para entregar na polícia. Não podemos mais lutar com ele em Cataneu e nem África. Os nativos mesmo, os donos, os mbumbo, não gostam de nós, são brancos. Nós trabalhamos com o governo dos brancos, é por isso que eles não nos gostam.
On the 8th of April 1992, 3-2 Battalion were involved in an incident where members of the public were shot and killed in Fola Park, Gauteng. The incident brought heavy criticism upon the battalion from both the African National Congress and the public. An investigation was launched, and in 1993, 3-2 Battalion was decommissioned.
The message came that, listen here, now we're going to disband this battalion to send you different places. But they're going to be also an optional. If you want to resign, there's a package. We're going to give you a package, then you have to resign. Because if you think you cannot fit into this government, then you're going to take your package, you go somewhere. And a lot of them, when they heard about the money, then they resigned. They chose to get a package. And when the package came, it wasn't as they thought that's going to be. It came mostly, some of them 50,000, and some of them 20,000, some of them. Well, those who are lucky one, I call it lucky, but even though it's average, 100,000. I mean, 100,000, you can't even buy a house, you understand? So the people face a severe suffering.
What happened to 3-2 Battalion was happening right across the South African Defence Force. With the handover of power to the ANC, many troops felt that they had been betrayed by the very country they had fought for.
How the South African people treat us, they treat us very badly. They forgot from the beginning that for them to rebellate this country, and it caused our fathers and brothers dying in our country.
They had fought this long war in Angola, in Mozambique. This is the white apartheid government trying to hang on to power, and they'd been pretty rough about it. So when power began to shift from the white government to the ANC, there was a sort of rush for the lifeboats, basically. And I mean, these guys knew that their contracts were being torn up, their pensions were going to be scrapped. There was also going to be a whole truth and reconciliation process. And so they were really looking for something to do.
Ostracized, unpopular and unemployed, the men of 3-2 Battalion were languishing in the isolated town they had been banished to.
O government antigo nos falou que vai nos dar o benefício para nós, com nossos filhos, com nossas mulheres, para nós descansar e deixar a tropa. Até hoje, aqueles promessas, por isso nós estamos aqui, que nos encontrou aqui, porque saímos, nós falamos, não, vão nos dar nosso dinheiro do tempo que nós trabalhamos na tropa, para nossos filhos gozarem bem e nossos netos gozarem bem. Nós até hoje não temos aquela garantia que eles farão. Estamos sobrevivendo no processo aqui no security. 2.200, 2.300. É isso que estamos a sobreviver até hoje. O batalhão que era muito famoso, strong one.
When the newly formed private military companies, or PMCs, of the 1990s, such as Executive Outcomes and Sandline, offered them work, they jumped at the chance. Conflicts new and old needed men with their hard-earned skills. Pomfrey soon became known as Mercenary Town.
Well, we went to join Executive Outcome because after the disband of the unity, we were jobless.
Azisendo tunakapa mukuana muswalali wa Defense Force ya South Africa. Sendu jatu jike. Baze tunakapa ni kuwana mu executive inakapa mbite haya. Inakapa ngwe tulande yuma yesidi ize mutwana.
The veterans of 3-2 Battalion would be back fighting again in Angola and then in Sierra Leone, where brutal civil wars raged. Today in South Africa, the veterans of 3-2 Battalion are largely forgotten, their reputations tarnished after years of mercenary fighting. Barely surviving on poorly paid security jobs, the men of 3-2 Battalion now lead a pitiful existence.
They still call us Makwerekwe, which is refugees. Even the cops, they stop you, they ask where's your ID, you show your ID, you're South African citizen, but when they see the country of birth is Angola, and then when you give them a little bit of briefing that I was in X32 Battalion, it become worse, they will tell you that you used to kill us before and during the apartheid system. But they forget. Most of them, they were trained in Angola. Who trained them is Angolan people, but they don't appreciate. Still, these things of we not belong to this country is still stinking. And Pomfret is like a cemetery. If you see the graveyard there, it's big now. Massive graveyard. Even me, if I die today, I'll be taken to bury there. My parents, family, all of them buried that place. Friends and all over from 3-2 Battalion buried there. The house is abandoned. Pomfret, it's like a graveyard.
Unable to return home, but languishing in a foreign country that would rather forget that they ever existed, 3-2 Battalion face a wretched end to a once glorious military career.
Our leaders left us like this, like a dog. This is a painful for us. Like myself, I'm old now. No one is looking for me. Only my son. Pain. You see, pain. The government